Good evening. So we are getting close to Shavuot. I want to talk about a halachic issue which comes up. The truth is, it doesn't come up that often in Eretz Yisrael. It comes up a lot more often in Chutz La'aretz, but it does come up from time to time, and this year it's relevant, and that is the question of Eruv Tavshilin. And many times when you have Yom Tov, which falls out on Erev Shabbat, so Shabbat follows immediately after Yom Tov. I say in Chutz La'aretz this is far more common because you have the extra day of Yom Tov. So whenever we have Yom Tov, which falls out on a Thursday, the first day, the second day would be Friday, and then you're going to what's known as the dreaded 3-day Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz. But so here we don't have that, except for Rosh Hashanah maybe. But this year we have Shavuot falls out on Friday and Erev Shabbat, and we go immediately into Shabbat. So we get a taste of 2 days in a row. 2 days of Kedusha. What could be worse, right? But in any event, so we have a takana, what Chazal made called an Eruv Tavshilin, which is a halachic mechanism which allows us to prepare from Yom Tov to Shabbat. We'll talk exactly how it works, how it's done, what kind of preparation are we talking about. By the way, it's just interesting. The word Eruv means to mix up, right? Now, that's where it comes from. There are 3 types of Eruv that we have in halacha. There is the Eruv Tavshilin, which we'll talk about now. There is also an Eruv Tchumin, which is whereby a mechanism which allows you to extend the Tchum of Shabbat, how far you can go beyond the city limits. And then there's an Eruv Chatzerot, where you have a Chatzer, you have sort of a courtyard and different homes within the courtyard to carry from one to the other. You have an Eruv Chatzerot. The truth is, normally when we just use the term Eruv, we're not actually referring to any of these 3. When we talk about as an Eruv in a city, what we really should be saying, we're really talking about is Tzurat HaPetach, which means that we enclose the city or the area, however it is, so we don't have walls, we have sort of artificial walls. Instead of walls, you have a Tzurat HaPetach, which is the shape of a doorway, where you have a pole from one side, a pole on the other side, a string across. Once we've done that, once we have the entire perimeter of the city or whatever area it is enclosed, then we do an Eruv Chatzerot as well in order to be able to carry there. So it is related to Eruv Chatzerot, but when we say Eruv, we're usually not actually talking about an Eruv. But in any event, talk about Eruv Tavshilin. So what is that? So the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tav Kuf Kaf Zayin, quite a long Siman, talks about Dinei Eruv Tavshilin, begins as follows. He says, Yom Tov shechal liot be'erev Shabbat. So when you have Yom Tov, which falls out on Erev Shabbat, falls out on Friday, as Shavuot does this week, in fact, Lo yevasher batchila letzorech Shabbat bikdera bifnei atzma. Okay, so all of this begins because we have certain malachot which are forbidden on Shabbat but are permitted on Yom Tov. Notably, we're talking about cooking. A person is allowed to cook on Yom Tov. Okay, there are certain restrictions. You can't light a fire from nothing. If you have electrical devices, so that has its own questions. But the actual act of cooking, which is a forbidden malacha on Shabbat, is a permitted malacha on Yom Tov for the sake of ochel nefesh. However, what is the cooking that you're allowed to perform? You're allowed to cook for the purposes of Yom Tov. You can't, a person now says, it takes me a long time to cook, whatever, now I've got Yom Tov, I've got the day off work, I'm going to spend the whole Yom Tov, cooking for the entire week. That is completely forbidden. One may not do that. That is malacha. You're cooking on Yom Tov for the sake of chol. So says the Shulchan Aruch over here, he says, Lo yivashel b'tchila letzorech Shabbat. Even if the next day is Shabbat, on Yom Tov itself, you should not be cooking for Shabbat, you should be cooking for Yom Tov. The truth is that nowadays, it's far less common for people to cook on Yom Tov at all. Most of the time, most of the cooking is done on the Erev Yom Tov anyway, which raises its own question. If we're not going to cook at all on Yom Tov, do we need to do the Eruv Tavshilin? Can we say the bracha? Okay, we'll get to that, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So says the Shulchan Aruch, Lo yivashel b'tchila letzorech Shabbat bikdera bifnei atzma. Don't take a separate pot and in that pot cook the food for Shabbat, because you should be cooking food for Yom Tov. Aval mevashelu kama kderot leyom tov im otir leShabbat. Okay, all of this is before we have an Eruv Tavshilin. So says the Shulchan Aruch, if a person is cooking for Yom Tov and you have a few different pots, you've got the chicken, you've got the potatoes, you've got the soup, whatever it is, and in each pot you have enough food that you're going to have the food for Yom Tov, and there's going to be left over, and you can have that for Shabbat, so that is fine, right? You don't have to be, if you're cooking anyway for Yom Tov, you don't have to be so exacting with the quantities, and you can cook a little bit more. That's explicit in the Gemara, and that's left over, that is fine. However, to cook specifically for Shabbat would not be permitted. And then he says, however, if you have an Eruv, Tavshilin, So then then you can come along and you can cook for Shabbat as well, right? Which is the next day following. Why would you not be allowed to? Why do you need to do the Eruv? Why would you not be allowed to cook for Shabbat on Yom Tov in the first instance? So it begins like this. So really, from the Gemara, it sounds like, according to everybody, that it's an Isur, probably going to be an Isur D'Rabbanan, right? To cook from Yom Tov for Shabbat, before we performed an Eruv, on a Torah level, on a Doraita level, it seems that it would be permitted. And it would be permitted for one of two reasons. This is a machlokes in the Gemara between Rabba and Rav Chisda. Either it's permitted because we say that on Yom Tov you can't cook for a different day. It's only when that other day is chol. It's not fitting. It's not. The Torah said you can do melacha on Yom Tov. You can do melacha for the sake of the day which is kadosh. You can't do melacha for the sake of a Yom Chol. But what if the next day is not a Yom Chol? What if the next day is Yom Shabbat, which has a level of sanctity, which is higher than the level of sanctity of Yom Tov? So says Rabbah in the Gemara that on Yom Tov, from the Torah, you're allowed to cook for Shabbat. That is opinion number one. That is one opinion in the Gemara. That is Rabbah. Rav Chisda disagrees. Rav Chisda says no. When the Torah gave us license to cook on Yom Tov, it gave us license to cook on Yom Tov for the sake of Yom Tov, not for the sake of Chol, not for the sake of Shabbat, not for any other day, for the day of Yom Tov, and that's it. By the way, this is why in Chutz La'aretz, when you have 2 days of Yom Tov, right? So you can't, every shul they'll announce, right? Don't do any work, don't do any preparation from the first day of Yom Tov to the second day of Yom Tov. Why? Because the reason we have 2 days of Yom Tov in the first place, this is why we don't have it in Eretz Yisrael, is because once upon a time, right, we weren't sure about the calendar. We spoke about this months ago. That we weren't sure when Rosh Chodesh was, and the cities which were far away, the Shlichim didn't get there, or when they had the bonfires, they put bonfires on the wrong day, so to confuse people. So in extra, it began as a minhag, later became a takanat rabbanan, that we have a second day of Yom Tov. Why do you have the second day of Yom Tov? Even though now we have a fixed calendar. And now we know for sure when Rosh Chodesh is, and we know when the date is. The takanah was established based on the way it was originally enacted, which was out of safek, it was out of doubt. Right? You have 2 days there because you're not sure when Rosh Chodesh was. So maybe the first day is actually the Yom Tov, and the second day is Chol, is an ordinary weekday. But maybe the second day is meant to be the Yom Tov, so therefore the first day is actually meant to be Chol, meant to be an ordinary weekday. So therefore, if we were to say that the first day was actually meant to be Yom Tov, by preparing for the first day of Yom Tov to the second day of Yom Tov, you're essentially preparing from Kodesh to Chol. You're preparing for a day which is you're keeping it, you're relating to it as Yom Tov because you're not sure, but it actually may be maybe an ordinary day, and therefore you can't prepare from one to the other. Okay, so says Rav Chisda that on Yom Tov you're allowed to cook for that day of Yom Tov, and that's it, not for anything else. So why, on a Torah level, would you be allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat, which is the next day? So says Rav Chisda the following svara. He says because you might have unexpected company. You might have guests might come knocking on the door. Since guests might come along, we have this in Hilchot Yom Tov. A number of different concepts which come up are used. We almost have these code words. You hear people talking about Hilchot Yom Tov. You hear people talking about mitoch. Mitoch just means since, which is to teach you that since a certain halacha was allowed, a certain melacha was allowed for the sake of Orcha Nefesh, it's allowed also not for the sake of Orcha Nefesh. Not our topic now. So here as well, the word hoil just means since, but it becomes a code word. Well, it means since guests might come knocking on your door, and they'll come inside and say, "Oh, I don't have any food." It's Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook, so you can cook the food for them, right? So if you're cooking food on the day of Yom Tov, even if your intention is that it's going to be for later, that it's going to be for the next day, for Shabbat, since there's a chance that guests might knock on the door, or they might knock on the door, they might just arrive unannounced, and then you might have to use this food for Yom Tov itself. Therefore, on a biblical level, in Doraita, you are allowed to cook. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, even for Shabbat, which is the next day. That's what Rabbah says. I got confused. Chisda said the first part. Rabbah says hold. But now, Midrabanan, they said the following. They said, okay, Midoraita, you can cook on Yom Tov, even for the sake of Shabbat, which is the next day. But Midrabanan, we say you can't do that. You can't do that unless you have an Eruv Tafshil. Okay, and the reason is two reasons. One is because of Kavod Yom Tov. and one is because of Kavod Shabbat. One is because of Kavod Yom Tov, because Chazal were worried about the following thing. We say a person knows, as we saw in the Shulchan Aruch, the person knows they're allowed to cook on Yom Tov for the sake of Yom Tov itself, not for any other day. So for a person, you're going to say, you can cook on Yom Tov, you can cook for today, you can cook for Shabbos, you can cook for whenever. What happens? The person might inadvertently or willfully come to cook more and more and more, and they might come to cook on purpose for a day which is not Shabbos, for the day after, which is after Yom Tov, and that would be an Isur Doraita. It would be an Isur Doraita to cook for a day which is Chol. So therefore, out of Kavod Yom Tov, to make sure that the food that you're cooking on Yom Tov is only what you're allowed to cook, we say you're going to have to do an Eruv Tavshilin. I still haven't yet explained what it is, but we'll get it. And the other reason is because of Kavod Shabbat, which is actually, again, this is also a machloket in the Gemara between Rav and Rav Ashi, that Kavod Shabbat is exactly the opposite svara. Chazal said, we're so worried a person's going to come on Yom Tov to make sure you have a lavish meal, you have you have all the food, you have everything you need for your Sudat Yom Tov, you're going to forget about Sudat Shabbat, especially in Chutz La'aretz. Sometimes you see that when you have the 3-day Yom Tov, so everybody makes so sure, to have, you've got all the food and the meat and the chicken, whatever, for the first day, right? The first night, and the first day lunch, and the second night, and the second day lunch. Comes Shabbat, who's hungry? Who wants to have any more food, right? But there's a mitzvah to have Shalosh Sudot on Shabbat. So say Chazal that on the one hand, right, we're worried that you're going to be cooking on Yom Tov, you're going to come to cook too much, and you're going to come to cook for Chol as well. So therefore, we say don't only cook for Yom Tov. On the other hand, say exactly the opposite. You're going to come to cook on Yom Tov. You're going to come and cook all your Yom Tov food. You're going to forget about Shabbat, which is the next day as well. So you need to do something to remember Shabbat also. So out of Kavod Shabbat and Kavod Yom Tov, Chazal say the following. We need to have a certain mechanism in place, halachic mechanism, which is called an Eruv Tavshilin, which is a takana. Everybody has to do this. And when you have done this, then you will be allowed to cook from Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you'll be allowed to cook and prepare for Shabbat, which is the next day. So what is the Eruv Tavshilin? And what are we doing? So says the Rama, he adds in here after the Shulchan Aruch which I read. He said, Perush Inyan Eruv. The meaning of this Eruv is the following. Sheyivashel v'yafeh miyom tov leShabbat. In order that it should be permitted to cook and to bake from Yom Tov for Shabbat, meaning you are using something which you already cooked or you already baked, you already prepared before Yom Tov came in. You're using that, and before Yom Tov you announced that this was for the sake of Shabbat. And therefore, what this means is that on Yom Tov, if you now begin to cook something for Shabbat, you're not beginning to cook it, you are just continuing. So what we do is we take a food which is designated before Yom Tov comes in, and generally speaking, you could take a hard-boiled egg or a piece of meat or a piece of fish, whatever it is. You take a cooked food together with a piece of bread, or if it's Pesach, you would use a piece of matzah, right? The reason why is ideally it should be both a cooked food and a baked food, because there are those who say the cooked food allows you to cook and the baked food allows you to bake. Others say one or the other is good enough. But nonetheless, we take the two. So we take the cooked food and the baked food. We designate that before Yom Tov, saying this is part of the preparation. This food is part of the preparation for Shabbat. So in that sense, you've already begun the preparations for Shabbat. You're remembering that Shabbat, the Sudat Shabbat needs to be prepared as well. And part of on Yom Tov, it's not that I'm beginning something new, that I'm continuing the preparation. It's linked to that. It's linked to that Eruv which was prepared before Yom Tov, and that continues, and that is used for Shabbat itself. So this food needs to remain intact. It needs to be at least a kazayit. It needs to be there. A person should not eat it on Yom Tov. It needs to be. Generally, the custom is that it's eaten on Shabbat, to be eaten for Sudash Lishit or whatever it is. But that is kept together. So a person will take this food on Erev Yom Tov at some point. There'll be lots of reminders. Everybody sends out a reminder, right, the day before. Everybody do Erev Tavshilin. Do Erev Tavshilin. Hopefully now we understand a little bit more what Erev Tavshilin is. You take this cooked food. It doesn't actually have to be something that you cooked, right? You have it and you're designating it. It's better if it's something you cooked. You lift it up. You say the bracha. There's the bracha of regarding the Erev, and you make the declaration saying this is the Erev. You put it aside, and this now allows you to cook and to do whatever else you need to do on Yom Tov for the sake of Shabbat. Right. Another question which the poskim discuss here is, what does this mechanism really allow you to do? Is this just regarding cooking? Is it regarding other things as well? What about washing the dishes? What about setting the table? What about lighting candles? Are we required to make an Eruv Tefshilin in order to light candles? Because you light the candles on Shabbat, but that is for the sake, you don't light candles on Shabbat. Just checking you're listening. You don't light candles on Shabbat. That is forbidden. Midaraita. But you light candles on Yom Tov. That is permitted. But you light the Shabbat candles you're lighting on Yom Tov. In a sense, that is preparation from Yom Tov to Shabbat. Do you need the Eruv Tefshilin in order to be able to do that? What about if you don't plan on cooking? What if you're staying in a hotel, or you're staying somewhere else where you are not doing any cooking at all? Would you be required to perform an Eruv? Or you're at home, but you're not doing any cooking at all on Yom Tov? All the food's made before, and all you need to do is just heat it up. When Shabbat comes in, and you'll put it on the platter, right? Would you need to do an Eruv in such a case? So we'll talk about some of those questions a bit more tomorrow. Rabbi Hanania ben Akash Omer, Sakad Baruch Hu Zakot Yisrael, Yifrach Balem Dom Mitzvot, Shnei Ma'adanech V'Tzman Tzidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadro.